Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our meeting of the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee. We have a pretty full agenda today, but most of what we're going to do once we go over just some business up front is we're going to discuss the proposed draft for the recurring analysis that DOJ staff has been producing each year, and then also we'll get some updates about new areas that we had raised with them that we asked them to look into with greater detail, and they've been hard at work at that, and we'll get a little bit of an update today and probably more as we approach our next full RIPA board meeting. So why don't we begin, just have our board members introduce themselves. I guess I'll start. I'm Steve Raphael, Professor of Public Policy, UC Berkeley, and I'm the gubernatorial appointee to the board. Andrea, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director of Alliance San Diego. Glad to be here.
How about Edgar? Oh, we can't hear you, Edgar.
Sorry about that. My name is Edgar Hampton. I'm the PORAC representative and the law enforcement representative on behalf of the RIPA board.
Last but not least, Lily.
Hello, thank you. I'm Lily Kajabi. I'm a professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and I guess one of the Attorney General's appointees to the committee.
Okay, great. So our first order of business is we need to review and approve the minutes from our last subcommittee meeting. So why don't we just take a few minutes to look over those now while we're here? And then if someone wishes to make a motion to approve them, we'll entertain that motion.
I'm good with it. I'll make the motion to approve the minutes.
And
All right, so can we just all in favor, aye? Or raise your hand? Does that work?
aye.
Aye.
Okay, so the minutes are approved, which brings us up to our next item on the agenda, which is the overview of proposed subcommittee work and updates by the Department of Justice. And I believe Kevin Walker will be briefing us. So Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Walker from the California Department of Justice Research Center. And I'm going to provide an overview of a few things. What's been accomplished so far this year and passed along for review during this meeting in the meeting materials, as well as some of the data analysis that is ongoing and reaching the point when we're coming up with initial drafts. And some of these things that we discussed will be things that we hope to provide in advance of the full board meeting that occurs in October. But they're still in early draft form at this point in time. So for starters, I'd like to kind of share my screen here just for some context and go back over, let's see, this. What I'm sharing here is the full outline report outline that was distributed to the board in advance of their last two full board meetings, the most recent one being early June. And what we've accomplished thus far, and what you have in front of you and in the meeting materials, is Section 4, that's entitled Analysis of Wave 1 and 2 Stop Data. So that includes the descriptive analyses that break down stop data demographics of individuals stopped, as well as various points, outcomes throughout the course of the stops, and then it includes the tests for racial and ethnic disparities. So the report content that maybe you've reviewed in advance of the meeting should look familiar, and that it's the analyses that were in last year's board's reports that the board is choosing to move forward with from year to year for kind of a continuity, so that people know what to anticipate seeing. And then things that we're still in the process of working on right now and are hoping to provide in advance of the full board meeting, at least in partial drafts. Of course, we'll incorporate feedback from you all, would be in these other sections in section 5. That's going to be a more focused policy section. And so in support of some of the contextual information that the Civil Rights Enforcement section is working on surrounding some of these topic areas, as well as making best practices recommendations, the Research Center is working on doing some data analysis to provide some data to support these sections as well. And so these sections include a section looking at addressing transgender disparities, a section following up on some of the disability analyses that were included in last year's intersectional section of the report-specific research questions, following up on some of the preliminary analyses looking at consent searches, and then following up on some parole, probation, known supervision, post-release supervision search analyses that were included in last year's report. And so those are some areas in which content is coming but wasn't included in the meeting materials because we are still in the process of drafting those initial sections. So I'll move over here to a PowerPoint presentation. Let's see, screen share. PowerPoint. So that out of the way, let's get into a presentation about some of the things that have gone good. So I'll first go over stop data submission for 2020. And kind of get to speak to the volume of records that we received for that data collection period, which is the most recent data collection period. Then I'll go over some of the tests for racial and ethnic disparities that are included in the meeting materials for today that you all may be familiar with from last year's report as well, but repeated for the 2020 data. And we don't have time to go over all of the individual analyses that are included in the meeting materials, but I encourage everyone to read through those when they have time, because there are some things that we may not touch upon in the presentation that are included there. And then I also want to make a little bit of time to kind of give you a look forward to the types of analyses that we're working on in support of the policy sections of the reports. So to start, as an overview of some of the stop data submission. So in 2019, which is the data we analyzed in your 2021 report, there were 15 agencies submitting. In 2020, 18 agencies were submitting. So we had 3 new agencies. Those agencies were the Bakersfield Police Department, Davis Police Department, and the Los Angeles Unified School District Police Department. In 2020, together, these agencies submitted just shy of 3 million stop data records, which is about 1 million fewer records than we received in 2019. Which during discussions earlier this year, I'm sure that we were talking about how we were anticipating a reduction in the number of stops that we would see data for in 2020, given the pandemic that began at the beginning part of that year and is still ongoing. And so again, in 2020, we did see that CHP submitted the largest number of stops of any one agency at over 1.5 million. Followed by the Los Angeles Police Department on down to a couple of the more recent additions to stop data collection being the Los Angeles Unified School District Department that submitted the fewest, followed by the Davis Police Department with the second fewest stops of any single agency. And these agencies are much smaller than a lot of the other agencies that were collecting during this time period. These agencies elected to begin collecting and submitting stop data prior to when they're required to by statute. These were Wave 4 agencies that were going to start collecting at the beginning of 2022, but elected to begin collecting early. And so getting into some of the tests for racial and ethnic disparities that we repeat in these reports. So we're looking at the 2020 data for the purpose of this presentation right here. And these tests, for to jog people's memory, we look at comparisons to residential population information. We look at search and discovery rates. We also examine the veil of darkness approach, and then we also do some analyses that look at use of force rates. And so the first of those here that's included in the draft materials is a comparison to census data. And so this is the 2020 RIPA data compared to the most recent data for the American Community Survey at the time when these analyses were conducted. And these are, so the gray bars in this chart are the residential population of the areas served by the agencies that were collecting during 2020. And the blue bars are the proportion of stopped individuals that fell into each of the race and ethnicity categories. And similar to years past, what we see here on the two ends of the distribution, right, we see that Black individuals constituted a much higher proportion of stopped individuals than they do the residential population of the areas served by the agencies that were submitting data in 2020. And at the other end, we see in the opposite direction, we have multiracial individuals, which constituted a much smaller proportion of stopped individuals than they do in the residential population of the areas served by the agencies collecting data in 2020. One thing that's noteworthy and different from the examination of the 2019 data to the 2020 data is, as we're getting smaller agencies coming on board, the 1 year detailed American Community Survey file that we were using previously to perform these analyses as our source for census data did not possess the proper basically geography units to allow us to get good comparisons to some of the smaller locales, such as Davis or even Sacramento. And so because this is only going to be more of an issue moving forward as more and more small agencies come on every year, we moved to using the 5-year files, which do possess better data on incorporated areas that might be smaller, so that we can get good counts for areas like Davis, Sacramento, even I believe San Diego is one of these areas, even though that's a very large locale. But the unfortunate part of switching to that file is that that file possesses better geographic information for us to compare to, but it does not contain as detailed ethnicity information for survey respondents. And so for that reason, you might notice here that we do not have a gray bar for the Middle Eastern or South Asian group for the residential population comparison. Whereas before we were able to, using the 1 year file, code a group that closely approximated the RIPA data group for that group. The 5-year file does not allow for us to do that. And so in all likelihood, a majority of those individuals are now captured in the gray bar for Asian individuals. And so something that the board may wish to consider discussing during your discussion today is whether you'd like to potentially create in the RIPA data an aggregate group where we group in the Middle Eastern, South Asian individual group to the Asian group to make a more of a one-to-one comparison potentially there in this graphic, but that's the main difference across these years. Getting into the search and discovery rate analyses, overall search rates and discovery rates were fairly similar to what we observed in the year prior, with those two rates being within a percentage point of each other across years, with one of the main differences in search rates when we look across race and ethnicity being that Native American individuals had the 3rd highest search rate in 2020 when they had the 4th highest search rate in 2019. So they traded spots in that distribution with Hispanic or Latino individuals. And so we'll look here at the next slide where we see these rates compared to the rates of white individuals. And again, here we see a trend where the search rates of Black, Hispanic, multiracial, Native American, and Pacific Islander individuals were higher than white individuals, with Black individuals having the largest difference in search rates, having a almost 12% higher search rate than white individuals. And all of these groups had lower discovery rates, meaning that officers discovered contraband in a lower proportion of stops, where they performed searches of individuals of these groups. The only group to have a higher discovery rate than white individuals was Asian individuals. And in this year, 2020, we saw that multiracial and Pacific Islander individuals had lower discovery rates than white individuals, whereas in 2019, in the data, we observed that each of those groups had slightly higher discovery rates when looking at these results. And so those are some of the primary differences across years here on this analysis. Looking at the Veil of Darkness analysis here, which again, for people who may not have been around for the many conversations we've had about this approach in years past, kind of assumes that evidence of racial profiling would be most apparent during daylight, when officers may be better able to perceive the race or ethnicity of individuals. Oops, I'm seeing a poor network connection. Can people hear me still?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Oh, okay.
See the
Maybe.
PowerPoint.
All right. So long as it's not my connection. Okay. So, and so what we do in the Veil of Darkness test is kind of compare the proportion of stopped individuals from a given race that they can post during daylight hours to the proportion that race constitutes during hours of darkness. And sometimes people hear this to mean that we're looking at stops that occur during the day and comparing them to stops that occur at night. That's not the case. We are, if you look at this figure here, I'm going to focus on the figure B here. We're looking at stops during what's called an inner twilight period, which is in the evening times, hours between about 5:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. And so these are all stops that occur during the same time period. Just at the same time period during different points in the year, have different lighting conditions outside due to times that the sun goes down at various times throughout the year. So if you make a stop, as an officer makes a stop of a person at 7 p.m. in January, that's going to be in darkness. Whereas if that officer made a stop of that same person in July, that stop would be at 7 p.m., that stop would be in the daylight. And so that's kind of how this analysis is set up. And so it's mainly an analysis geared towards looking at traffic stops. So we restrict to stops where officers indicated that the reason for a stop was that they observed a traffic violation. And we only look at stops in the inner twilight period. And we do not examine stops where they were made in response to a call for service, because those stops are more likely to have other information that's influencing an officer's decision to make a stop. And we want this to be mostly self-directed stop activity from the officers. And similar to what we observed when looking at the 2019 data, was that darkness decreased the rates at which Black individuals and Hispanic individuals were stopped when compared to the rates of white individuals, meaning that a higher proportion of their stops were during the times of the year when it was light outside during the inner twilight period, when presumably it would have been easier for officers to discern their race prior to deciding to initiate a stop with these individuals. Now we did repeat these analyses, given that CHP makes most of the traffic stops that we see in the data, and this is an analysis that's specific to traffic stops. However, we obtained very similar results after doing so, as you can see there in the second bullet point. That did not have too much of an effect we still observed that Black and Hispanic individuals seem to be less likely to be stopped during the dark hours of the period. This is the only way, or not the only way, but one of the features about this year's analyses that are different than last year's is that when examining the 2019 data, we also observed that darkness had a decreasing effect on the rates at which individuals in the other race category, so not Black, not Hispanic, not Asian, and not white, those individuals were stopped, but we do not see that in the 2020 data. And then moving on to the last test that we have in this section of the report, which is an analysis that looks at use of force rates, so the proportion of individuals from a given racial or ethnic group that were stopped that officers used force against. And here we observed that Black and Hispanic individuals, when compared to white individuals, had higher odds of having force used against them whereas individuals whom officers perceive to be Asian or in the other race ethnicity category for this analysis had lower odds when compared to white individuals of having force used against them. And so, again, for this analysis, we did reperform it, again, without the inclusion of CHP data. It had little impact on the size of these differences. So that's something to note there. And so that's a brief run through of the tests for racial and ethnic disparities that we've run again this year using the 2020 data. I know that there were a lot of questions earlier this year about, we're very interested to see what it looks like with the 2020 data, because we know that it will be smaller in volume of stops that officers performed and submitted to the department. However, a lot of the analyses yield results that are comparable to what we observed in the year prior. So in addition to the analyses that I just went over there briefly with you all, that are included in the meeting materials that were circulated for today's meeting, we're also in the process of doing some analyses that are going to hopefully bolster some of the policy sections and provide context by adding some data to them. And so what I'm going to do is go over some of the analyses that we're in the process of performing and writing up for inclusion in a future draft, just so you all can get an idea of the types of things that are already in progress. And if you can think of any other ways that you'd like to see the data broken down, or analyses or questions that you may have that are under these kind of umbrella topics of these 4 areas that I'm going to go into here, that you all have an opportunity to discuss that amongst yourselves and let us know, so that as we're drafting this up, we can add in any additional analyses or considerations that you may have. So the first of these would be analyses to kind of provide some context to the transgender disparities discussion that's in the policy section. And so here, we plan to have subsections that look at search and discovery rates by gender, as well as use of force rates, and then also looking at the reason for stop distributions across genders and looking for differences there. Having done some of these analyses already, we also go into some of these subcategories of reason for stop, so looking deeper into the reason for stop reasonable suspicion subcategories, where officers indicate what gave rise to their suspicion, what circumstances those were, whether it was that they observed the commission of a crime, a witness reported a crime to them. So we look at that across the gender categories as well here. And then we also take a look specifically at some sex work related offense codes here and stops that were initiated in response or because officers suspected someone as violating those offense codes. And this was in the offense codes that we focus on here are the offense codes that in a letter to the board in advance of your June full board meeting that the ACLU submitted. So they identified 6 offense codes that they were specifically concerned about enforcement of, and that potentially having a disparate effect on people perceived to be LGBT. And so we also look at proportions of stops of individuals across the gender categories within the RIPA data, and the rate, basically the proportion of their stops that are for those sex work related offenses identified by ACLU. So that's the plan for some of the initial analyses that we'll provide to you all in advance of the full board meeting. Following up on some of the disability analyses that were in the intersectional portion of last year's RIPA board report that originally looked at search and discovery rates. So we'll be looking at some more search and discovery rates, breaking that down by disability categories, as well as, oh, sorry, I didn't go over this on the last slide. These pictures on the right side of these slides are kind of just for context to get people thinking about the types of analyses that we might have moving forward. I'm not specifically going over those here. And also going over some use of force rates by disability type, and then again, looking for differences in reason for stops and the subcategories thereof. And then looking at some common offense codes that officers reported stopping individuals for violating potentially. And some of those that we see there, that currently is where officers will indicate that a stop arose from a community caretaking interaction. And what we see in the data is that those rates vary widely across the disability categories. And so we also do some dives into the data looking at stops that were initiated during community caretaking interactions and contrasting those with stops that were not initiated within those contexts here. And so in this example slide over on the side, you see here that we're looking at search and discovery rates across disability type, and then contrasting that with stops that were initiated during a community caretaking contact and those that were not. And so that's kind of a peek into some of the stuff that we're doing there, and we'll have content for you all in advance of the full board meeting. Analysts have completed initial passes of doing the analyses. We're in the process of writing them up now. And then we have a section on consent searches as well. And here we're going to go over things that kind of build upon the foundation that the board laid for these types of interactions in its last report. So looking at the rate at which officers ask individuals across race and ethnicity for permission to search them. The rate at which, when asked, individuals of various race and ethnicity categories consented to those searches. And then looking at the proportion of times when officers received consent, did they actually follow through with the search? And the proportion of the time when officers asked for consent, did not receive it when they continued on with the search. And then looking at search rates and contrasting those when consent was the only basis, there was consent as well as one or more other bases for the search, and then looking at those contrasted with discretionary searches where consent was not one of the bases. And then looking at discovery rates for those as well. And then here's where we're trying to work in some analyses that would look at kind of our proxy approach to looking at vehicle stops versus pedestrian stops. We're looking at traffic violations versus reasons for stop that were not traffic violations here, but comparing rates across groups that occur within those two contexts and how often officers asked for consent and performed consent searches during those two contexts, and looking for differences across race and ethnicity groups, as well as the type of search that officers performed, whether that's a search that they asked for consent and performed a search of that person or their property, or both the person and their property. And then the last of these policy sections that we're hoping to provide some analyses to support would be the supervision conversations. And so looking at search rates where the basis provided was that the person was on supervision with search conditions, and then contrasting those with supervision searches where there's other bases as well, or searches where there's supervision was not a consideration for performing the search, looking at discovery rates there similar to last year. And then also looking here this year at the types of contraband and evidence that officers discovered during those types of searches, as well as how when those searches were conducted and across the reason for stop. So looking at if these types of searches were more common during vehicle stops or traffic violations, stops for traffic violations for some racial and ethnic groups compared to others, and they maybe occurred during the context of stops where they were known to be on supervision more for other groups. So looking at that as well here. And so those are kind of sections that are ongoing right now. We're in the drafting process. In addition to those for the policy section, in the meeting materials that were distributed to the board in advance of their last full board meeting, there was a section in there that kind of is introducing this idea of pretextual stops. And so the idea, I think, with that section this year is to lay the groundwork, introduce the idea with the intent that the board will go more into detail into those explorations of that issue in a future report. And so to kind of add some data to that discussion, we're also doing some analyses that look at the distribution of moving versus non-moving and equipment violations, as well as looking at some of the common offense codes that officers stopped individuals for when they stopped an individual for a moving violation or an equipment or a non-moving violation, and looking to see if those vary by race and ethnicity. And so those won't be as deep of a dive as many of the other sections that I've been talking with you all about here today, but there will be some data from 2020 there to provide some context and a look into the data that we're collecting here in the state to get people thinking about pretextual stops. And so just to kind of sum it up, the initial drafts that are circulating that you all have in your meeting materials here deal with the stop data demographics of individuals stopped in 2020, as well as tests for racial and ethnic disparities. And then the department's hard at work providing or drafting up sections that will look at some more policy-focused areas for discussion, and we're supporting that with data, looking at transgender disparities, doing some follow-up analyses for disability, and then consent and supervision searches, as well as introducing the idea of pretextual stops into the board's report. And so we hope to provide you all with draft content of that in advance of the next full board meeting, or potentially should the subcommittee decide that they want to have another subcommittee meeting in advance of that meeting, say towards, I think that meeting is October 9th, I want to say. I could have the date wrong.
October 20th.
Okay, I'm way off then. Okay, sorry. I don't know what October 9th is for me. If the board subcommittee wanted to have another meeting, maybe early October or something like that, if board members have time, we maybe could go over some of these analyses in more detail during that time. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what's been done thus far this year, as well as the plan moving forward. And we're looking forward to hearing the discussion that board members have about this plan, as well as anything else that they're interested in seeing included in this year's report for future years. So I'll turn it back over to Steve. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so we have time now in our schedule to discuss what was just presented to us. I think, you know, the first part are all results that we've seen before, but now with a different year. And it's kind of interesting how constant and stable those patterns are. But we have some new topics that we requested in the past, particularly the gender identity work, the disability outcomes, consent searches, and the supervision search outcomes. And I think it might be helpful for us if we have things that we really want to see in those areas to reiterate that now, to make sure if it's not in the ream of results that Kevin and his staff have produced and they're currently wading through, that they end up in there. And then also, of course, we can offer feedback about the first half, right? The standard analysis that we're doing from year to year, if we think that there are things that should be changed. So how about we open it up, and board members are free to offer comments and thoughts.
May I ask a quick, more general question first about the subcommittees? I was wondering, and I don't remember offhand, unfortunately, when the next policy subcommittee meeting is, and in particular, if the drafts as they're evolving would be shared. Some of us are on both subcommittees, but would be shared with that committee as well.
So the policy subcommittee meeting is on August 19th. And we, by that date, we won't have a write-up of the data, but we might be able to have some of the raw data, just in terms of how it's presented. We might be able to have that for discussion then.
I guess I mean at a minimum, for example, could these, so far we have the draft as it exists now, and Kevin, thanks for walking us through much more as well. And also there's a sizable appendix of tables. At least, will that information also, maybe this is more a procedural question, can the policy subcommittee kind of reach to this work that's already been done as well? And so would those, even the materials that were shared for this meeting, would they be shared beforehand for the policy subcommittee meeting too?
So usually we don't share them, for the different subcommittee meetings, the ones that apply. But in this case, we might be able, we can certainly refer the policy subcommittee to these materials since they are on the website, and we can let them know that they might contain some of the data that they might be interested in to review some of the topics that are being covered. So we will have a lot of the narrative also for what Kevin is describing and some of the background research for it. We just probably won't have a written narrative about the data itself, but more the background. But we can potentially, we'll have to discuss it, I think, within DOJ to see if we can actually have some of the raw data, perhaps some of the charts or graphics or tables, we might be able to present some of those in time for the policy subcommittee meeting.
Okay, thanks. This also helps me understand better the interactions between the subcommittees as we're moving. forward.
And this is
Yeah,
a new
I can
thing for
add.
us. Yeah, sorry, Kevin. This is a new thing to have, these intersecting, the intersecting topics with the subcommittees. But we're trying, I think it is in response to the board wanting, the data and policy to, have this intersection and be able to work with both, and therefore then take the data and turn it into policy best practices or recommendations. So we're figuring this out a little bit too, and how they might intersect, but we can certainly, it's a great idea, and we can point the policy subcommittee to these materials as well.
Yeah, what I was just going to add there is, I just want to second Allison's statement that we probably won't have narrative for that meeting, but we certainly do have results of analyses that we've done. A lot of results, and so I think, one of the things that we'll have to work on in advance of that meeting is that if people are interested in seeing some of those results, it's just finding a way to communicate some of them without taking up too much time away from the other more policy-focused aspects of those sections, as well as time for board member back and forth and discussion about those other sections. So there are plenty of results that we already have at this point.
Were you going to add something to that discussion about how the subcommittees interact, or looking ahead to the policy subcommittee?
Me?
Question directed.
Oh,
I didn't
I
hear
wasn't
what you
sure.
said.
I wasn't sure, Steve, if I heard you start to say something. And excuse me if I'm not. But okay, I think so. What I heard at a minimum is that these drafts are now available, and then to the extent that there may be further work done, that may or may not happen before the next. I understand that there might not be more available before the policy subcommittee, but the idea is that we now are in a new stage where we might see the two subcommittees, their work interacting or intersecting more. Okay, thank you. Because I think they should. I think this is great. Yeah.
One issue that we have to address eventually this meeting, probably on our last agenda item, is whether perhaps we want to have another subcommittee meeting before the full board, precisely to look at the culled or the curated results from these additional analyses. Perhaps we should talk about that at some point. Andrea?
Hi, Kevin, thanks for the presentation of the data. I had a question about the residential population comparison to stop data. I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding the information you shared. You have aggregated the stops from the data and the comparing that to the California residential population, but as I understand your notes in the text, it is not the state population that is reflected in your chart, but rather the areas, the jurisdictions of the reporting agencies. Is that right?
Yeah, so yes, so this is something that goes back to, I think it was September. It was a full board meeting, September, I want to say 2019, where we kind of discussed in the full board meeting some of the issues with the implementation of RIPA that made comparisons to just the California state population generally difficult, especially during these initial ramp-up years where we don't have agencies from every location within the state that are collecting. And so comparing the data to just the California state residential population would be much easier. However, we don't have reason to necessarily believe that the agencies that are currently collecting, which are only 18 agencies in 2020, are reflective of the entire state as a whole. And so when we perform the comparisons, we have to then kind of look at the residential populations of the jurisdictions that are collecting. And then we weight based on that, based on the amount of stops that those agencies perform during the course of the data collection period, so that it reflects kind of the areas in which most of the stops were occurring. And then that's how we kind of get. And I'll say that, if we look at the methods appendix from previous years. So like last year's published appendix, if you look in Appendix B, there's a discussion about the approach there, as well as strengths limitations.
Right.
That's in draft form right now, so it wasn't included in the appendix that was distributed for this meeting. And that's because we're having to edit that now to reflect the change from the 1-year detail file to the 5-year average file that we had to do for this year. And so the idea would be that we'll have that methodological discussion in Appendix B again this year. It's just not ready at this point to reflect the changes.
Yeah. My question was really about clarity around the residential population. I think that somebody would have to go read the text several paragraphs above the chart to understand it. So I think the fact that we're using a selected residential population should probably be reflected in the title, in an appropriate word, and also in the footnote. You do have in the draft report, you do have a footnote, but it doesn't mention this. It talks about categories and other things. And then there was a comment in the chat, which actually is related to another question I was going to ask, which is that I know we've had the issue of CHP data before sort of skewing things because of the volume of the data. And then, again, as the community member noted, that CHP is everywhere. So how are you handling CHP? Should we be breaking them out?
Yeah, so in the analyses that are in the test for disparities sections, we do have for each of those, we do those overall, which is the primary, because we want to make sure that we're speaking to the experiences of everyone who's stopped by law enforcement throughout the state. We also recognize that CHP serves a specific role that may differ from other agencies, municipal agencies, sheriff's departments, and offices. And so for those tests, we run them first with CHP's data, and then we exclude CHP's data, and then rerun them. And then we also we have 18 agencies collecting right now, and so including all of this in the narrative of the board's report would be potentially overwhelming for readers. But we do have in the appendices the information broken down for all of those tests by each individual agency overall, as well as for all the agencies except for CHP. And so in that way, we provide that information at the various different levels.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, and I haven't, I haven't looked at the breakout. I'm not sure if those are in our materials, but if there's a significant difference between the CHP analysis and the cumulative analysis, I think we should signal that in the report somehow, and possibly even do double graphs. I think specifically to my question around residential population, you said that this is in fact an aggregate of jurisdictions of residential populations in the jurisdictions of the reporting agencies, and I guess I need a little bit more clarity about how you're handling the jurisdiction that would be CHP, which is the entire state of California.
Yeah, so CHP's comparison within residential population information is the state population and the racial and ethnic breakdown of the state as a whole.
So then please clarify on whether, in figure 18 in the draft document, is that in fact the California residential population total, or is
you said figure
18? It's on page 23 of the draft document. Because you say in the text, or whoever's writing this, it says in the text above that this is just an aggregate of the jurisdictions, the populations in the jurisdictions. But I heard you say something different. So I just want to make sure that we're clear with the public about whether we are comparing stop data to the actual total California residential population or to specific areas of California.
Figure 18.
That's a question about CHP because it would make sense if it was just those reporting policing agencies that were local law enforcement. But if this data includes CHP, then what is that data set of California residential population? Full state or subsections of the state?
So figure 18 reflects the weighted distribution of the residential population of all agencies that collected data in 2020. So this means that it includes the comparison for CHP's data is the aggregate state population, but it also takes into account the proportion of stops that occurred from LAPD, for example, and it would compare those and weight those according to the residential distribution of people who live within the city of Los Angeles. And so it takes into account the comparison between an agency's stop data and the jurisdiction that they serve. So if you wanted to look at just the CHP's data compared to the residential population of California, you could look in the appendix for that.
Yeah, that's not my question though, Kevin. My question is, on figure 18, you have a total cumulative, and there is a discrepancy between what you say in the narrative here in the report, which is that this is an aggregative selected population, and what would be CHP or the full California residential population. So if this table or this figure is an aggregate that includes CHP, does that mean that it also includes the full residential population? That's what I'm trying to understand. I get the agency by agency comparison, but here you've got a graph that's all encompassing, and I'm just trying to get clarity whether this is the true California residential population. If it is, then we need to make that clear in the text.
Kevin, perhaps if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm pretty sure what that graph is if we think of each jurisdiction as having a composition of the population that they govern, right? So CHP would be the entire California population, and LAPD would be the city of Los Angeles. Then we have distributions across race and ethnicity. And then we also have the proportion of the total stops we're measuring for the year that are CHP, LAPD, so on and so forth. And what's in that table is basically a weighted average that's proportional to the number of stops the jurisdiction is making. And so it's, and I guess a different way, and I guess I can see where it could be confusing because we have California and then we have these and how do we take an average of the full? Mathematically, it makes sense. But perhaps another way to present it might be to just separate CHP entirely and compare it to the state. And then for the subpopulations of the jurisdictions, maybe that could be a separate graph, and then we wouldn't have, it just might be a little clearer, although I think it'll show roughly the same. My guess is it'll show roughly the same thing.
Yeah, Steve, that is exactly, what you said is exactly what figure 18 is. It's what we kind of worked through at that at that full board meeting, or the idea initially came up for this approach came up at that meeting in San Diego in 2019. I believe that's when it came up, and we've since talked about it multiple times, and went back and forth with you, Steve, about this. And so we could do a graph that is CHP's data. A bar chart that's CHP's data compared to just the California population, and do a bar chart there, and then we could have another bar chart that is the rest of the agencies, and then use a similar method to what we're employing in figure 18 currently, because without just doing a separate chart for each agency's data individually, there's no way to really get around the need for adjusting to account for the proportion of stops that each agency's data account for in the the comparison group with the ACS data. So we could do that, but basically what it would look like is we'd have the CHP data alongside California aggregate, very straightforward race ethnicity breakdown in the ACS data, and then we'd have another figure that's all of the rest of the agency's data compared against the weighted distribution what we have currently. But at least it would make the CHP comparison very straightforward for people.
Yeah, I think
If
that
there's
would,
confusion.
that would be really helpful because I think just for transparency, right? We want the lay individual to understand what this data means. If somebody has to, have a deep knowledge of the layers to understand how a graph is like state data plus weighted jurisdictional data, that's asking a lot of all of us who are not statisticians. So I think that would be really helpful, and I think it's worth considering all the other places where CHP data should be pulled out, if only because the volume of the data on that first slide that you showed us is just so much larger than all of the other agencies reporting combined, right?
Right. Oh, we can work on creating a separate figure that does that more straightforward CHP to California population comparison. No problem. Incorporate that, and then I think that what we'll do is hopefully, Steve, Lily, maybe we can lean on you two to maybe kind of try and workshop some of the footnotes and the language and the labels for these graphs that would help communicate the method being used there to kind of try and make the for the rest of the agencies the residential population comparison take into account basically stop volume in these different areas of the state. So hopefully I know I'm volunteering you, Steve and Lily, to assist us with that, but hopefully that we can find some time for us to workshop that with you.
I mean, the light at the end of the tunnel here is when we have data for the whole state, it all becomes very simple. Then we just have state distribution. But in the meantime, we're trying to piece together.
Yeah, it's a simple frequency chart with just the state population and a frequency of race, ethnicity, and then the appendix just becomes well, the appendix doesn't really change except for the overall and the municipal rows, but yeah, it will be much easier come when we're analyzing data for 2022. What year will that be? 2023 for the 2024 report. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. You're totally right.
I'm also hearing from this discussion the just general reminder again that CHP is so large and the volume stops so large that there's a continued wisdom to analyzing that data separately so it doesn't obscure what's happening in smaller municipalities. And that also, even though it's nice to have very simple, straightforward labels for everything, if it somehow obscures what's behind inadvertently what's behind the scenes, that it's okay to let some of the labeling or footnotes get drier or more detailed, so that if somebody has a question about one, there isn't an ambiguity inadvertently behind this.
Yes, and for just for informational purposes, like I know in some of the stuff that I've been reviewing recently, where we're looking at, I'm using this as an example of the effect of CHP. When we're looking at these introductory statistics, looking at traffic stops and looking at moving violations and non-moving violations and common offense codes that officers initiated were the primary reason why they stopped people. When we're doing those analyses, we find that they look different. Looking at the entire data set where CHP constitutes the majority of those interactions anyways. And so, when we're doing that, we're like, okay, we can do this to reflect everything, but we also need to repeat these analyses and include them in the main body of the report because they look different when we take CHP out. And so we are trying to be cognizant of that as we're going through and looking at results of the analyses that we're doing. But as we present them in future meetings, if people have ideas about, well, I wonder what this would look like without CHP, please let us know. But we are trying to consider that.
I'm relatively new to the board. What do you mean they look different? I don't understand what that means.
Right. So, like, for instance, if we see that using this as a specific example, right? If we see that the most commonly cited, or when I say cited, I mean that officers are indicating that the primary reason for stop, not that they're issuing a citation. That's not what we're doing in the section that I'm talking about. But the most common 5 types of offense codes that officers indicated were the reason for making a stop when they're doing a stop for a non-moving or equipment violation. Those top 5 most commonly reported codes look different. They're different, like they're 5 codes. Some of them might overlap, but if we run that, look at what the 5 most common ones are, and then we remove CHP's data, and then analyze the rest of the agency's data, those top 5 could be 3 of those might be different codes than we saw the first time around when we looked at CHP's data. Because CHP's practices are likely different significantly from, say, the practices of the Los Angeles Police Department, right? And so that's what I mean when we say different. They should be collecting data the same, but when we look at results of analyses, they will be different depending on those.
So Kevin, I just had a couple of comments also that some are minor, and then others just might be footnotes, and then maybe 1 or 2 are more sensitive, or more substantive. So I think it would be useful in this report, just because of the weird year we're in, and just for posterity and documenting this very historical, crazy time we're in, that actually maybe add a chart that shows the volume by agency by year of stops and how unusual 2020 was. I just could imagine somebody reading that 100 years from now and finding that little nugget there, and it might be worth just documenting that. Another one, another issue with regard to that population denominator. So I understand that once we get down to those lower census places, we don't have the microdata anymore, and we have to use the summary, and then we can't match the race definitions in RIPA to what the census does. But it's probably going to be the case that Middle Eastern, South Asian, so the Middle Eastern in the census will end up in white, and South Asian will end up in Asian. So those categories might be slightly higher than they otherwise would be, and maybe a footnote just noting that. And then when we finally get to all of California, it can be fixed again, right? And I guess the good point is it doesn't impact any of the other analysis because everything is outcome based, but a footnote noting that. The one thing, and I don't remember if I saw this, but in the Veil of Darkness work, it might be interesting to look a little bit at sort of interactions with race, age, and gender. Some sort of intersectional analysis there about whether the decline when 7 o'clock dark as opposed to 7 o'clock being light is larger for some groups than the other. And since we made this discussion of stops that were for non-moving violations as a factor that was going to be analyzed, it might be interesting to see how that changes too. Are non-moving violations less likely when it's dark outside relative to when it's light outside? And so I think that just to put a pin on that, in that for when we do dig into that next year in the coming, that it might be another outcome to look at, just the composition of stops. And that's most of what I had. I'm really excited to see the disability results, in particular the mental health, and I think it's good the way you've broken it down, where you have mental illness separated from everything else. So that, and then the supervision searches. I know how tricky that is because you don't know whether everybody is on supervision, right? So it's only whether they were flagged as a cause for the search. But I'm looking forward to seeing all those additional results.
Forward to showing them to you all once we get it written up. But just a question here, Steve, because the audio, at least for me, was a little bit choppy when you were talking about kind of intersecting some other identity characteristics into the analysis for VOD. I heard clearly the part about looking at non-moving versus moving potentially when we go deeper into pretextual stops and analyses to support that section next year. But can you repeat the part about the other identity characteristics to me?
Oh, sure. So there are summary results about, the likelihood of how the likelihood of being stopped conditional on black, or, how the disparities change with the shift in daylight. And I wonder if those, and you summarize them in your presentation to us. I wonder if those effects differ by race interacted with gender. So is that different for black males versus, black men versus black women? Or, is it in particular, if, for young African American men or young, you can imagine the age profile where you could estimate separate effects for different age groups. Kind of very similar to, I'm trying to remember last year, we had suggested kind of estimating an age profile in one of the outcomes we were seeing. And it seems like since we think this veil of darkness is it's a particularly stringent test, and given what you're finding, it might be interesting to see, a little bit more disaggregated in those results. That's all I meant.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I just the audio was a little bit fuzzy for me the first time around, but I've got a note here about that, so let's forward.
And that's, yeah. Let me see if I had anything else written down. No. That's all I got. Are there any other comments on this, on Kevin's presentation, or maybe let's ask specifically, is there anything in the gender identity section, disability consent searches, supervision searches that we collectively want to emphasize, that we definitely want to see? And the one thing I would emphasize is separating out mental illness and disability. I think that's very important.
Currently, we have, when we run the analyses in that section, we do break out individuals. So we have like 3 comparison groups to not overwhelm the page. And so we have here, well, not 3 comparison groups, but 3 groups being compared. We have persons perceived to have a mental health condition, and then we have persons perceived not to have any disability, and then we have persons perceived to have another disability. So that's kind of how those comparisons look like as the draft and how the analyses stand right now, which is similar to how the intersectional piece was broken down last year when we were looking at disability intersected with race and looking at search and discovery rates.
Maybe I'll just take the part. Given our discussion of CHP versus everybody else, my guess is that once you get into stops for moving traffic violations versus moving violations, there we're going to see very, very big differences between what's happening on the freeways and what's happening in municipalities. So just another plug for making that cut, or always keeping that cut in mind.
And on that note of the moving and non-moving, can we look quickly at, maybe I'll just pick 1 or 2 questions I had that I know there's more to come. I'm very excited about how things are progressing and the next iteration, the analysis that's still coming. But could we look briefly at there was a very large appendix with lots of tables, as there are different ways to measure what's happening, looking at the RIPA data. And Kevin, do you have handy that it's the very large file with all of the tables?
I have a bunch of tabs open. I believe that I think I'm in that right now.
So this is among the information that was shared before
Okay.
the meeting. Maybe I could just pick out 1 or 2 questions I had, and some of it will tie to analysis that's coming, but I was reminded of it in what just came up, the moving versus non-moving, but also the earlier discussion about what kind of labeling shares enough detail that it's clarifying. So I was actually looking, for example, on page 5, and for those who might have access to it, there's a table of stops by identity group and traffic violation type. And I realized that there are different headings like moving violation, but equipment and non-moving are separate headings. And I know that the tables aren't going to contain detailed definitions, but I just wanted to emphasize that maybe the report will distinguish like what is an equipment violation, since equipment is typically non-moving also, and what's in the category of non-moving. And it might turn out that even in the labeling here, I don't know if the labels are being pulled in from, our crunching through the data, or if you can set the labels a little differently. But that was one that I realized I had questions about which ones are the equipment and which are the non-moving violations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to speak to that issue some, and I think we have people from the Civil Rights Enforcement section who are maybe a bit more in tune with the actual wording of the regulations than I am. So y'all, please feel free to chime in here if I get this incorrect. But those three values included in that table, moving, non-moving, and equipment, are from the regulations, and they're three separate fields. So it's a field, and officers have to select one value from that field. So we're not like mining in the data to identify key terms or anything like that to get those three categories. Those are actually selected by officers when they're entering the data. My recollection, though, and I don't have the regulations in front of me, is that I don't recall express definitions there in the body of the regulations. And I do know that from some of the preliminary dives into the data that we do see overlapping offense codes input between, say, non-moving and equipment violations. And so some officers may be entering in that they stop somebody for, I don't know, whatever, a non-moving violation, tinted windows or something obstructing their view of the road. And they may select that that's a non-moving violation, whereas sometimes officers may select that that's an equipment violation. There's nothing in the system, to my knowledge, that would prevent them from doing that. And so there's not separate tables within the stop data collection system for if you select moving violation, then you have this subsection of the vehicle code available to you to indicate what offense you observed. And then if you selected another reason, like equipment, then you have a different subset. So unfortunately, there is going to be some overlap there. And I believe that we have observed some of that so far in some of the.
And so maybe within the analysis in the report, it will make sense to combine those two categories, equipment and non-moving.
That's what we've done. Yeah, that's what we've done.
So I just wanted to, so that the tables align with or are clarifying for folks. I just wanted to flag that. And actually on this same table, I realized, is there passenger data mixed in? Because as an example, I see, 1 to 9-year-olds and these moving violations. And I was thinking, are there, little drivers out there, or is this representing something else? I don't, and this time it might not be a question we can answer now, but I just wondering ahead.
Something that we've seen before in the data and asked that ourselves. I mean, sometimes we're able to, and when we've looked at cases in here where we have a traffic violation, the code that they cite is the person was speeding, and then they indicate that the perceived age of that person is like 11. Is it that they stopped someone's, a guardian or whoever they're riding in the car with, and maybe they took an action towards the entire, like everyone got out of the vehicle, and that would require them to enter stop data on that 11-year-old because they took an action asking them out of the vehicle. And then they had to enter data? Or is it that potentially they entered in, it was a typo and they meant to put 21 and they typed in 1 twice, didn't notice. And so it's hard for us to tell if we were to go through on a case-by-case basis and looking at the totality of the entries that they made for all of the fields across this 11-year-old in this hypothetical example, we see that they were stopped for speeding and they were issued a citation for speeding as the result of stop. I don't think that that's something that an officer would do if there was an 11-year-old operating a motor vehicle. And so therefore, we can assume maybe that this officer entered in the age information incorrectly, but it's tough for us to know that because there is no indicator for whether or not a person that they're entering data for is a passenger. I do believe that, and the specifics of this are escaping me right now, but I do believe that the proposed regulation amendments that are circulating right now and that I believe that the board's going to meet to discuss in August do have some proposed changes that would make that easier for us to identify moving forward by creating somewhere where officers would indicate that this is an action that I took towards a passenger rather than the driver of a vehicle. But currently that doesn't exist within the data.
Yeah, it may be that driver, pedestrian, or cyclist and passenger also should be identity categories in the revision. Yeah, I think that really is a question leading to looking ahead to the opportunities for public comment, also for the new way that any modifications to the RIPA data. I had a question about a completely different graph. Table, and I wonder if we could just look at this one too. There are lots of them here, not all of them, but in anticipation of a report coming, and it was about the actions taken, and I realized there are tallies that say overall action taken or average actions taken, and I think it's a count of maybe some of the, I'll say the most maybe common or extreme actions like handcuffing people, things like that, but it's table A6. I'm looking at page 14 as a concrete example, and I just wanted to ask about this one because this might be also a direction that where this year's report reports on things that weren't in past years in the analysis. So page 14, and so you'll see for stops that are made, there's a tally by racial and ethnic group, for example, and gender identity and so on. Overall actions taken is one tally, and then average actions. And I'm wondering if those labels could be clarified or footnotes added. And again, this might be in the report. Like, does average actions mean average number of actions out of, I don't know, the most common 4? Let's say I see none of these numbers go over 4 or 3. I guess I wasn't sure what this table was counting exactly. We could try to deduce it, but the final labeling, no one should have to deduce what it
You're
is.
absolutely correct about that. So we can provide some clarifying language here, maybe in a table note for this table. But this table is getting at, so the overall average actions taken is basically just totaling the number of actions taken. So there's all those reportable actions, right? Asked someone out of vehicle, used OC spray, dog bit them, et cetera. So there's 23 reportable actions, and this is basically just calculating the average number of actions taken when looking at all for like the first row of this table. All Asian individuals in the data set, on average, how many actions were taken per individual. And so that's 0.23 actions taken. It's less than 1 because in most cases, officers don't indicate having taken any of those reportable actions. And then the second column here is, okay, now we're excluding instances in which officers did not indicate taking any reportable actions. So we're getting rid of all the zeros in the calculation of this average. And then we're calculating again for when officers took 1 or more actions, was the average number of actions that they took towards individuals of a given identity group. We do this for all identity groups here in this table. So we can certainly add language to a table note or see if we can workshop the headers to better reflect this calculation. But yes, we can certainly workshop that.
I appreciate the interest in seeing, like, capturing not just for a given driver did a specific action happen, but sort of how many, but the number is, anyway, yeah, some context for the numbers, because also the severity of these actions vary so tremendously. So yeah, it seems like there's more to get at here.
I believe that also there's a table here.
I think one of the later tables lists all of
Identity group actions taken.
But this doesn't include actions like citation issued also, so which is perhaps one of the most common ones, I believe. So as the report is developing, if there's analysis around these tables, I think it will require more explanation of which actions are being looked at in detail,
Right.
Which I'm looking forward to. I think again these are things that are really moving to get a deeper look at law enforcement. And I'd like to look maybe at one last very quick question. Let me just find maybe one other table. Oh, this was one where I realized from the labeling I wasn't sure what fraction it was capturing. I'm looking at page 20. Not to go through every table, but I was curious about this last one. It was, so on table 20, it's the last section of, again, looking at actions, and in particular by race or ethnicity. And it says search person consent given, and I realized I wasn't sure, was that search person consent given, was it the number who gave consent out of the number searched, or was it number
Right.
of consent given out of number searched, or was it number who gave consent out of the number who were asked? And
Right.
And I know you have other tables that break down how this issue of consent. There are lots of questions we can ask about how officers are using this discretion and how it impacts drivers, but I realized that label, I wasn't sure. And so it might turn out for some of the tables that even though it's elegant to just have a table, that there are hefty footnotes that are, or more detailed footnotes that are.
Yeah, for clarity on that one, so there's 2 values at the end of, what table is this? A8, which is the table that breaks down all actions taken during stop. As far as we're concerned with like how the regulations define actions taken by officer during stop, this doesn't capture things like issuing a citation. That'll be in a table that goes over the result of stop, because that's captured separately.
Mm-hmm.
But this goes over actions taken during stop, and so yeah, those last 2, that's why they're at the bottom of the table there, is because those 2 actions taken during stop are conditional values, where they're only relevant if the officer indicated that they asked the person to search either their person or their property. And so those reflect the counts of individuals whom officers indicated said yes to these 2 different search types from those groups. But the denominator is basically the number of people from a given group that they asked for consent to perform a search, either person or property, depending on the right. And so that they're different from the remainder of the actions in that regard, because those 2 values are conditional, whereas the rest of the values in this table are available to officers to select for all cases. So note here about adding a table note there about those 2
Yeah, I
rules.
appreciate what you're saying. So maybe the label can be very explicit and say, this is the count of this number out of this. This is the numerator, this is the denominator, so that there's no ambiguity. Because there's so much work being done here. There's a lot of data, and now richer and richer dive into it. And as Andrea pointed out earlier, we really want people to be able to, those who want to look more closely, that it's clarifying. And the closer you look, the more clarifying it could become.
Yes, I've got a note here about clarifying the denominator for those 2 rows.
And it's hard to do when you're steeped in the data and you're, producing all of these tables. You're already steeped in it, and so it can be harder to. It's harder for us to all see, like when we step back. Okay, when we're first looking at it, what is this?
That's extremely helpful for us, because we're, the analysts and myself are looking at this stuff all the time, and so we may not think to ask the same type of question that somebody who's taking a look at the table for the first time, who hasn't already produced it a bunch of times in the software, may ask. And so it's really important for us to hear people give us this type of feedback.
Yeah. And for the policies subcommittee, well, for the whole board, and in particular looking at policies, some of the data that's here is really going to be helpful to point at particular recommendation. Thank you.
Kevin, I had just one last question, then I'm done. But I was wondering on the moving and non-moving violations part, given that I think there's a C for the actual violation. Might it be possible to separate registration violations and everything else? I wonder if that's a big category, and if that's a useful way. I know they have the moving and non-moving, and officers are picking either one, and there's some ambiguity there. But registration and, I'm trying to think what else would be in that category besides equipment and having expired registration tags.
The work that Rachel's done so far, looking at some of the most commonly recorded codes or vehicle code sections that come up when officers indicate equipment violation, registration is among the most common. So it would be possible for, and we do in a portion of the analyses that are included in that section that we're working on, separate out, okay, this proportion of stops were for registration violations, either not having current registration or not properly displaying current tags. I think that there are two separate vehicle code sections for that. And so we enlisted the help of some of the attorneys over in the Civil Rights Enforcement section to help us understand which of these vehicle code sections we should probably group into categories that reflect different offense types, and registration was among those categories. But it is the question if we should, or is the suggestion that we should have an appendix table that breaks down registration, stops, and some other.
Or maybe instead of dichotomizing it as traffic and all else, maybe traffic, registration, and all else. Just because I think that maybe there's creative policy that one could think about of addressing registration violations without a stop. And, if we knew what the volume was and how important it was to contributing disparities, there are other state agencies involved in registering a vehicle, and maybe there are other things we can do to, as a state, to assure that people are current on their registration and then avoid stops in the first place. So I think maybe, if it's proportionally important, maybe we can report on it and think about it as important.
Yeah, I've taken down that as a note for maybe something that we can include in that area where we're talking about, where we're looking at the different types of traffic stops, contrasting them across moving and by race and ethnicity.
Okay, so I think we're doing okay on time, but are there any further comments from the board? If not, I'm sorry.
Andrea has one.
Yeah, Karen Glover asked this in the comments, but it was a question that I've been thinking about. Do we have enough data at this juncture for Wave 1 agencies to do any kind of look across the 3 years that they've been reporting?
This is actually a question that Dr. Emily Owens, who provides comment and assists us with formulating drafts to provide to you all, brought up last week during one of our conversations, and we were kind of discussing it within the context of all the additional analyses that we're providing this year, and then also considering that for Wave 1 agencies, we have 8 agencies. The first year that they collected data was half a year. The second year was a full year, 2019, and then the third year was a pandemic year, 2020. We were kind of discussing, and mainly it was me making these points. I'm not sure if everyone else agrees, but it may be difficult to kind of examine. It would introduce some complexities in trying to account for the fact that we have half a year of data in 2018 and then comparing that to a full year of data in 2019, and then having a very major crisis that our country and our state and the world, but we're examining data in California, was experiencing during 2020, and then trying to account for, well, what proportion of differences that we see between 2018 and 2019 are because we have a different data collection period for those two time periods, and what differences between those years and 2020 are really changes in potential policy or practices at departments, rather than changes in the way that both police departments and the public kind of conducted themselves during the pandemic. And so it's certainly something that we want to do moving forward, is look at the data across years. Looking at the data for 2018, 2019, and 2020 for 8 agencies in this year's report, I think may be complex, and it's something that we could look into, but we have to also balance that with all the additional sections that we're working on this year, and beginning that in August might not be something that we could really take into account the full spectrum they would be affecting changes across years.
Thanks.
Okay, so any more comments? Going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and we look forward to seeing the next round of results. Thanks for your presentation and the conversation and listening to us. So next on our agenda, why don't we move to public comments? And since I think last time we started in Northern California, why don't we start in Southern California, and then we'll move up the state. So does anybody in Southern California have a comment for the board? And I'll just say ahead of time that the board probably won't respond, but we're listening and noting the comments that you have. Any takers? Oh, Mr. Hilton? Oh, we can't hear you, sir. I'm sorry.
I hear you, and it looks as though my speaker, thank you. There has been much discussion about population groups and disparities that are produced using population groups as the denominator. It confuses me. What offends me is a representation using a population group that says blacks are 7%, or another that says there are more Hispanics than there are whites, because those both produce disparities that are not real, that are not true. So whatever methodologies are used, we need to make sure that we don't use numbers that artificially drive down disparities. And that obviously is the case with the two examples that I've just given. With respect to the notion that we may not have an adequate data set upon which actions may be taken, I beg to differ. And I dare say that most academics differ too. The Center for Police Inequity, which is the academic institution that is now in vogue, has issued 2 or more studies, all of which make recommendations that are actionable. And in each instance, they have used data that has already been collected to make those recommendations. So the question is no longer open. I think we may be drifting into being a data collection, not organization, but what we do seems to be focused on data collection rather than actions that are associated with data collection. And I speak most specifically about uses of force that I don't know how many of you have paid attention to it, but that is on an upward trend, irrespective of the place where the data comes from. So that needs your attention. And I spoke of this almost exactly a year ago, and I speak of it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilton. Are there any other comments in Southern California? I'm just monitoring the chat as well. Okay, how about Central California? Okay, finally, we'll move up to Northern California. All right, well, seeing none, maybe we'll give one more second. Okay, Well, thank you for your comments, and we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which I believe is our discussion of next steps. I think our main concern at this point is whether we want to have one more meeting to review some of these, to provide feedback to Kevin and staff, with regards to the other analyses that are forthcoming prior to our October meeting. So why don't we open that up for conversation?
I'm open to it. It doesn't even have to be a full session, so to speak. But if we just want to shore up what everyone's thoughts and ideas are before we present them, I think that's always going to be a good thing. So I don't know. Do you need a motion for that or not? But I think it's a good idea to at least have everyone get together, what we're meant, and then put it after the fact.
I believe we may need a motion, and it would have to be a public open meeting. So we probably do need a motion. But our Andrea and Lily, do you have some thoughts? I would be happy to meet again, and I'm excited to see the results as they come out. But I'd like to hear you as well.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if Kevin wants us to meet again, but hopefully this feedback is helpful to you, Kevin. And if others are willing, I'm absolutely willing. I think that this helps us get to a better finished product by the time we get to the end.
Sorry, Kevin.
No apologies needed. I mean, I'm not trying to influence people's decisions. Board members make their decisions for themselves. But, I do feel that the analysts have been working on quite a bit more than I've had the opportunity to brief you all on today. And so I'd really love for you all to go into the full board meeting, having a better understanding of some of these additional areas where the analysts are working on analyses for, because I do fear that if we wait until the full board meeting for us to try and go over that, there's simply not going to be enough time for me to go over, I think from what I've been looking at right now, we have like 30 some odd pages of additional analyses that analysts have already produced that, I'm not sure that a 15-minute spot during a full board meeting would do that justice. And so if you're all available to meet again, I'd be in favor, or I would look forward to being able to present more information during that time. So please don't feel like you're creating more work for us. The work's already done. It's just about briefing you all on what it says.
This is great. So I hear not just some willingness, but really consensus from the board that the subcommittee that we'd like to meet again, and enthusiasm for that. So that's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay. So, Allison, do we need a motion, or can we just say we're going to meet again before our full board meeting?
I don't believe we need a motion on this because we generally have, it's up to the subcommittee to decide whether to meet again, and there seems to be a consensus. So I think, when we poll people, we can decide, this isn't voting to approve something other than having another meeting. So I think we can go ahead and work with all of you to schedule that meeting.
Okay. All right. Well, looks like we'll be meeting again, so we'll figure that out. And I think that's our last agenda item. So before we close, I just wanted to thank DOJ staff for all their hard work and the board members for showing up, and of course our loyal members of the public who come to a lot of our meetings and offer their feedback. And we do listen, and very complex topic, and it's good to hear everyone's feedback, right? It ultimately makes things better and work better. So unless we have any other comments, I think we can adjourn with a few minutes to spare. But we'll just make it up by having another meeting. So okay, all right, everybody. Hey, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Allison, and thanks, everybody. Have a good day.